Hello and welcome. My name is Carol Carter, and I'm the founder and CEO of Global Minded. And we are dedicated to creating a capable, diverse talent pipeline to get more women, people of color, poverty-affected students, and any way that you can define diversity into the education, economic mobility, and leadership pipeline. And we do that in a number of different ways. We have these monthly equity sessions, and Paul is our K-12 leader. We're delighted to be here every month with each of you. We also have one for STEM, we have one for health, we have one for higher education, foundations and funders, and technology. We have an annual conference, which is this June 22nd, 23rd, and 24th in Denver. We'll be live again after 2 years of virtual. And then we have programs with students to help them make a strong transition into college and to connect them with role models, mentors, internships, and jobs. We work with the historically Black colleges, the Hispanic serving institutions, the minority serving institutions, and several of the tribal colleges and those colleges that have majority Native American students, as well as state colleges with high Pell eligible population. Finally, we have Inclusive Leader Awards every year, and these are the role models, as many of you are as well, for the students that we serve. And we're really delighted that Ron won this year in the K-12 category, Ron Lessard. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Paul Miller, who is our host for today's session. And you can find him here every single month with incredible leaders as he has today. So Paul, so great to see you and these incredible guests on this very important topic. And want to thank everyone for joining, and also to say, we have just the greatest reverence and respect for those Native American leaders everywhere and Indigenous people around the world. Thanks for being here, Paul.
All right, well, thank you, Carol. I'm really excited to be here because we have something really special this month with where we're going to honor and recognize Native American Heritage Month. And how better to do that than talk about Native American education. And we're going to get into all different aspects, and we have some very capable, competent people here who are going to, in a second, they're going to tell me a little bit about themselves, who they are, what do they do, what their role is, anything that may be pertinent to make sure that people understand how relevant you are to this educational space, and also anything cultural you'd like to add. I know that we're going to start with Ron Lessard. And Ron, you got about 60 seconds to give us all the deets, give us all the details. Who you are, what do you do, why you're here, why are you passionate about Native American heritage, how are you connected to education? Tell us your life story in 60 seconds or less. You got to unmute though, Ron. It's hard to hear you when you're muted.
Okay, now I have 50 seconds. Okay.
Nope, you got 60 seconds, Ron. You're too important to only have 50 seconds. Come on.
Well, thank you, everyone. It's so great to see you. Great to be with you today. Good afternoon. Good day. Want to greet you with a warm heart and an open heart and a warm mind and an open mind. I want to thank Global Mind Ed and Carol and all the team at Global Mind Ed for having us today on this important issue of Native education. My family, we're Mohawk. I served, and I'm also a sun dancer, and I also was a Vietnam veteran. So I've kind of been through several things in my life, and always appreciating education as the reward, more or less, to get through certain things. I serve as the acting executive director for the White House Initiative on Advancing Educational Equity, Excellence, and Economic Opportunity for Native Americans, and strengthening tribal colleges and universities. I also serve as the Department of Education's Tribal Consultation Official, and serve on the White House Council on Native American Affairs and the Alice Spotted Bear Commission on Native Children. So that's a mouthful, but it's very full, and I certainly appreciate my work. I'm really thankful that I'm able to work in the field of Indian education and what we can do to make lives better and education better for our Native children. So thank you.
Thank you, Ron. Next, I'll go to Dr. Donna. Can you tell us the same thing? Who are you? What do you do? What's your connection to Native American heritage? And please share with us.
Sure, and I hate going after Ron. Always, they're too big of shoes to fill. In my native tongue, Sego, Donna Sabis-Burns, Young Yets, Oswego, Niga Nawego, Nuatu, Niga Wukan Golota, Ganigahaga, Niwangu Sota. Hello, my name is Donna Sabis-Burns. I am Mohawk. I'm Haudenosaunee, from a member of the Upper Mohawk Tribe of Citizen Turtle Clan. And I am the group leader for the discretionary grant program at the Office of Indian Education at the U.S. Department of Education. And I am thrilled to be here and so honored to be able to speak about the things that we're passionate about. And it's wonderful to be able to talk about these important things with education and Native Americans as we become more represented as time goes by. My personal side, I am one of the board members of Children's Literature Assembly, which is a subgroup of the National Council of Teachers of English. And we just recently had a panel of Indigenous authors, children's authors, convene on Sunday and had a wonderful discussion of these very same topics of education and children's literature representation of Native American kids and people and culture. And so I've been able to kind of throw my seasonings in there as this larger education role comes to me. So I think that's about 60 seconds. I don't want to go over.
Thank you.
That's it.
All this great stuff that we're excited to hear. I am, last but not least, I have, which he's with us. He had to make an entrance, everybody. We have Julian Guerrero. Julian, if you could, please tell us who you are, what do you do, your connection to Native American heritage, and how are you connected to this whole education world as well?
Wonderful. I'd be happy to. Thank you, Dr. Miller. My name is Julian Guerrero, Jr. I have the distinct pleasure of serving currently in my professional capacity as Director of Office of Indian Education at the U.S. Department of Ed. And by ways I'm connected to Indian education, just K-12 ed in general, is mostly through the nonprofit world as well as state service as well. And I've seen Indian education kind of unfold in many different lenses, whether that be at the school district level or at the tribal level, or state level, and now at the federal level. So much of my interactions with education really is all focused on the empowerment of the role of tribes and tribal sovereignty in public education. And there's plenty to talk about, and I'll leave it right there. But a lot of my experience is working through public education and empowering the role of tribes.
Well, thank you. Thank you all. You all have, it sounds like you have so many important accomplishments and so many important things that you're doing. And I really hope within this hour here that we just get to learn so much more about Native American heritage, education, and just educate people. Because, I think we were having a conversation offline one day, and I think it was Ron that said quite often the culture gets talked about, but the education isn't necessarily at the forefront. And so my hope is that we'll touch a little bit of both, but we'll get a much larger understanding of Native American education when we're done here. But I am going to lead with culture, and I'm going to ask a question, and I really want to know what are you most proud of in regards to your culture? Like, just educate us a little bit more. I know you all, I believe, are from different tribes, and culture may or may not be a little bit different within tribes. So we'd like to understand, like, what are you most proud of within your culture? And just if you tell us a little more, and I'll shoot it over. I'll start with you, Julian, since you were last with the intro. Tell us, we'll go with you.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I'd say the immediate thing that comes to mind is the ability to share in a culture amongst many others. Native communities are diverse. We have many tribal affiliations. There are 574 federally recognized tribes, and that is even mentioned the other state recognized tribes as well. And given that diversity, the common experience is the same, that it's a experience of survival, of resilience, of mission and drive and determination to, reclaim native languages and really exert tribal sovereignty, self-determination in everything that tribal nations work to do, not just education, but also public safety and health, mental health, as well as other means by which tribes exert themselves to provide for their people. And it's such a special privilege that goes beyond anything that I could ever describe with words. But knowing my own background as a Comanche and a Kiowa person, I care deeply about where my roots are as, being indigenous to the North American continent, and really thinking about what that means for myself, what that means for how I carry myself, my responsibilities to my tribal community, just helps me, look through the world in a certain lens that is focused on providing for Native peoples and representing them well. So that's the biggest pride for me.
And Julian, just before I ask the same question to other panelists, can you describe what does tribal sovereignty mean to people who may not understand what that is?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you'll get different answers depending on the type of folks that you ask. So there's a legal way to look at it, there's a social way to look at it, there's a political way to look at the definitions. But as you're asking me, how I, Julian Guerrero, would define tribal sovereignty is the ability for a tribal nation to insert itself into any environment and represent, support, defend, and provide resources for its citizens, and those citizens being enrolled peoples of that tribal nation. And it's all about nationhood. So tribal sovereignty is the ability to prove and show and display and support tribes who attempt to exert themselves and their nationhood in any environment.
Okay, thank you, Julian. And now, Dr. Donna, can you tell me what are you most proud of in regards to your culture?
Resilience. Resilience. It's been cultivated by focusing, I think, on, I don't know, maybe the areas of spirituality, mental well-being, emotional well-being, physical well-being. And in all honesty, when I was little, I did not know that I was Native American. We moved off the reservation area when I was very, very young, and never understood what I represented until my classmates would say, "What are you? You're brown. You're not Black. You're not white. What are you?" And I just said brown. I never really understood that. And as I started getting a little bit older and started questioning things more, finally it was my grandfather who lived on the reservation up in New York. He says, "No, he was mad at my mom for not really teaching me our culture like she should have, but it was, don't stay out in the sun too long because your skin will be too dark." That was the generation that she was raised in. And so it wasn't something that was instilled full of pride at all. So when I say resilience, and as I'm going into even now, I'm learning my language, and it's very difficult. I still stumble, as I did today. I still stumble. It's very difficult to learn. But I want to, kind of encapsulate the whole thing. When it comes down, it's resilience of being able to still be here, no matter the horrible things that have happened in the past, but also the wonderful things that we do. And so I think that's how I would answer that.
Thank you. So Ron, same question. What are you most proud of?
Well, for me, when I think of culture and traditions, our ceremonial ways, our spiritual ways, when our young people practice those traditions and culture and their ceremonies, and all the values that come with our our teachings, respecting your elders, respecting your family, respecting your own body. And if you follow that path, and especially for young people, you're less likely to get involved with substance abuse and alcohol. And you have models of people within your community that are leaders, that not only spiritual leaders, but educational leaders and healthcare leaders. And it's important that our young people see that. They see those examples. And if you follow that path from an education standpoint, you may not get all A's, when you're in school, but you'll be on a path of learning, the importance of learning and integrating what your elders and your families have taught you about tradition. And you want to do well. You want to make your family proud, and by following those traditions, you do that, and you make yourself proud as well. So, but I think having that background and that basic basis, helps you through lots of things. And like Donna said, and Julian said, that it helps you be resilient. And I think of even from a spiritual standpoint, when I Sundance, it's a couple of weeks out of the year when I'm really recharging my batteries, and then get ready to come back into the solid city of DC. So I think it's important that we teach our young children that.
Now, and this is a little off, but it's coming to mind, because what I keep hearing for all three of you is the values, culture, tradition, spirituality. I hear a lot that's coming to light. And so with that being said, I also noticed that within the circumference of this country, a lot of the traditional values, let's say non-Native American values for this particular example, sometimes can come off as very different than what the traditional values were meant or taught as when maybe before we were younger, or future or previous generations. I guess what is coming to my mind is, are those same type of issues happening within the Native American culture? So where there's where the values aren't meeting, where the traditional values that you've seen work so well for Native American people, are there any differences or struggles with that, especially when it comes to the younger generation of Native American people? Anyone could take a crack at that if you get what I'm asking.
Well, I'll go ahead, Julian.
Sorry, Ron. I'll just be really short with mine. I think, speaking to the value of the importance of representation in the public settings, whether that be representation in stories and film and multimedia, there are many ways that Native representation occurs, and you see a generational difference in how people value, how Native cultures value that representation. Some really value it more than others, and that's a big change that's currently underway now. And that's a difference that really happens within the Native community, and that's okay. Every Native community is different, and every tribe is different, and their values change. And I think that's the most important thing to bear in mind, is that as each Native community kind of grapples with its own values of how it feels about representation or other sorts of issues, that they can be heard, they can be seen, they can represent themselves. It's kind of the most important thing.
Anyone else with the values? Because I know I see it, I see traditional family values, and then I see the values of sometimes within the urban communities that I work in and in the schools that I work in, and I see that the values aren't necessarily always matching. And there's a number of factors which I'd rather see what's your take on it, Ron, Donna, Do you have any take on that, or is it not as much of a problem within the Native American community?
Yeah, I think it's a big problem. And I think it's one of the reasons, and it's like anywhere with any population, the influx of social media, and there was a time you could go on a reservation and you'd almost only see community members. Now there are lots of people that go there. A lot of our young people, it always reminds me of my friend who's a great violinist. When he was younger, he said, it's just not cool to play violin. It's much cooler to be the quarterback, and many times within our communities, I mean, if you say you're studying and you're going to ceremonies and you're learning your language and you're advancing in education, your peer pressure is really, really hard. It makes it makes it difficult for some, and so I see that. We have like in so many communities, we have grandparents taking care of the children. Where the parents have, for whatever reason, are not able to do that. So we're losing, we've lost that connection. From generation to generation, passing on stories, passing on things. And like with our languages, a lot of us are playing catch up to learn our languages because we didn't grow up with them.
And I think values and everyday values and values in education, without having that many Native American school leaders and teachers out in the field, it's difficult to have when you're teaching our kids. Who understands that being silent is golden in many of our lives. And if I'm not talking and chatting away, it's because I was taught to sit and listen. You listen hard and you hear. And a teacher with who may not be as culturally responsive just wouldn't know that about that value within Native lives in schooling. And I just recently I was telling the panel earlier that I lived in Hawaii for a few years, and I taught in the schools there. And it was amazing how much the Native Hawaiian culture parallels our own. Amazing, so actually. And having taught that and having my background, I had those values already instilled in me. And so I connected very well with my kids and the kid. I mean, people would come to me and ask me questions about cultural values and how to get, and then the family, understanding the family dynamic. And I don't know, it seems that we lose some of that. And I don't know if that's just me getting old and thinking, oh, those kids, but it just seems that we have. And so intergenerational living, I'm in it myself, and it's teaching them and teaching those values and over and over and over, and so they can hopefully absorb that much more than I had. So that was a great question. Thank you.
Well, thank you guys. And seeing that there may not be a lot of representation with Native American educators and some other, how does the education differ, whether it's on a traditional reservation versus a traditional public school? So we talked a little bit about values, but is there a difference in the education? Is it similar? What does it look like? Can anyone describe what an education might look like on the reservation versus a traditional public school?
I'm looking to Julian because he has lots of that experience.
Come on, Julian.
I'm looking at him
Don't
too.
be shy. We're gonna your card got full.
But I have an answer, but I look like Julian knows it from firsthand experience in teaching there.
I will say that the biggest difference is that a lot of it boils down to access. And coming from a social sciences background, typically, social studies refer to them as like primary documents, primary sources. Like in tribal settings, in the actual schools that are on tribal lands, there's so much opportunity to really access a lot of that primary cultural funds of knowledge indigenous ways of knowing, the local folks who could really tell the history of the nation and really speak to kind of ways that students can connect with their identities. And I think the biggest challenge that we face now is that given there's so much rich diversity in Native affiliations, is that long gone are the days of Native students just learning about one of their affiliations. They're having to learn about a lot. So you have Native students who need access to multiple indigenous ways of knowing and different tribal affiliations. So, the biggest difference, again, going back to the question, would be the simple access to resources that are much closer than you really. It's harder to get that in urban settings and even suburban settings that are not, for schools that are not located on tribal lands.
Ron, you too.
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, I was going to say one thing I think is that it because there's so much diversity there, there's not one education system from one tribe to another. But the one thing I do know that and a lot of tribes are very good at doing this, and a lot of communities, tribal communities, that how does one learn? So when you come from a culture of storytelling, and then you're told to read a chapter, we're going to take a test, it's just not the same. There was a very good program before I was with the Department of Ed. I worked for Corporation for National and Community Service, which was AmeriCorps and Senior Corps. And we had a very good program called Learn and Serve, where children learn during the day and they applied those things in the evening or on the weekend. It could be language, lots of other things. And the method of learning was really wonderful. It was a great program. And, and I think that's true across the board, of all populations and how we learn. So the real successful teachers understand that, even though there's a curriculum they have to follow and things like that. And, I think, Donna, you probably know that as well, that you have to, when you, like I said, you come from that culture where we learn by storytelling, and that's passed down. And then if we're sitting in a place where we're not even allowed to tell a story, our learning environment is really stifled, I think. So.
Oh, thank you, Ron. Donna, what do you think the largest successes that has occurred throughout the history of Native American education? Has there been any certain points throughout history or even currently that where Native American people have just seen a lot of success in education?
I think, yes, there's absolutely lots of success going out there. And I don't know if I can focus in on one particular, but there's a lot more that's needed. So, but we're making, headway of representation. I know we keep saying that word, but it's a lot different than what it was years ago. And, with representation, we didn't know, the first Caldecott winning, Alaska Native Caldecott winning award was given this year for the very, very first time. We have the Secretary of Interior, the very first time a Native woman in that position. There's just so many firsts with Native Americans in general. So when you see that, it trickles down into the education that, wow, now we have kids that look up and can see it's for real. And I think that is one of the biggest successes, is to have now more representation so we can be seen and heard.
Got you. How about you, Julian? What do you think the biggest successes within Native American education are, and maybe even a timeline, some point to within Black education of certain court cases that desegregated schools. Some might be, you might think of other pieces or items like that. Is there any really success items that you feel are important that people understand?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I would say the biggest success, most recent for Indian Ed on a national scale would definitely be, and Ron could speak to this tremendously, is tribal consultation. The advent of tribal consultation, occurred early 2000s from an executive order from the Clinton administration. But then as it kind of morphed and changed and went through a series of additions and changes to now, I think, to your point, Dr. Miller, a certain year in particular, when we look at tribal consultation being now involved in the Every Student Succeeds Act for K-12 Ed, and the most recent reauthorization in 2015, that reauthorization really kind of empowered this idea of what tribal consultation can be. And it can be a strong vehicle for tribal nations to really come to the table, be a part of the conversation, and learn about how public schools are impacting their young citizens. And that's so powerful. It's so important to have those local conversations. Because you might be surprised, but I certainly was at the state level when it first came out, was public schools and tribal nations really weren't sitting together at a single table to talk about test scores and assess proficiency and remediation and alternative school, and the list goes on and on. But with consultation as a vehicle, those conversations were not only empowered, but in many cases required. And I think that was a huge success for the introduction of empowering tribes to be at the table. And I think it's often undervalued, understated, underanalyzed, under-researched, and it's something that can really I know it'll kind of jumpstart so many other changes for future of Indian Ed. I invite Ron to also chime in on that as well for tribal consultation.
So Ron, that takes me to my next question. A perfect segue. So what does meaningful consultation between tribal nations and public schools look like? Help us to understand that, because there are, in a circle where we're not familiar with that, even in an educational term, I honestly would have to say I don't have a lot of knowledge or interaction with what tribal consultation would be. So what does meaningful tribal consultation look like, especially in relation to a traditional public school? That would be very helpful to educate us on that.
Well, so it kind of goes way back, and to put it in perspective of the Constitution of the United States, where there are three forms of government. There are federal, state, and Indian tribes. So those are sovereign nations, three sovereign entities. So that's an important aspect. And we have the Office of Indian Education, we have Indian Health Service, mostly based on treaties that the sovereign nations made with the United States, which were government to a government. So that's what we still do in a sense with tribal consultation. We work with Indian tribes as on a government to government or a nation to nation basis. So if we're doing something, whether it be education or whether it be healthcare or anything that could be changing a policy, rewriting something, a guidance or something, if that has an implication, if that has if the tribe is affected by that, or there's an implication on that, for that tribe, then we have to enter into consultation with that tribe, just like we would enter into consultation with Japan, or like we would enter into consultation with a state. We can't go into a state and just change the rules. And they shouldn't be able to come into a tribal nation and change the rules without consultation. A good example of this, many years ago, the FCC decided that it would be really nice to put telephone poles on tribal land, and they didn't consult. And as a result of that, there was a lawsuit and all these things, but it generated $10 million. And the $10 million was eventually granted to youth programs. And so there was some good that came out of not consulting at that point. But anything that has an impact on a tribe or tribal nations with the federal government has to be treated in that government to government relationship. And meaningful is a very key word, because we have things like, we have listening sessions where we inform tribes of maybe grants that are coming up and things like that. But if there's something that's happening that could have an impact on the tribe, we have to consult with elected officials of sovereign nations as they consult with us, with our senior officials of federal agencies. So it's at a high level, and it really should have an outcome that is either beneficial or is at least transparent, so that the tribes and the government know exactly what's going on. So that's a short, long answer.
No. So I think you gave a very clear answer of what the consultation is, but now I'm gonna ask either Julian or Donna to connect it to schools for me. So let's, like, how do we connect? So I got a very clear answer where you're saying it's how the government structure and how the consultation works before anything happens, but how does that now connect to like schools, and particularly even public schools or charter schools?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in first, Donna, if that's okay. So consultation, meaningful consultation on a local level, given kind of the context of the school district lens, I've seen it. I've been a part of those local conversations. What makes it meaningful is if it is driven by data, not just quantitative data, also qualitative data. Requires trust, acknowledging certain histories of the past, certain things that the district may have had in policy, or experiences of certain tribal peoples that are being brought to light in these conversations. It also what makes it meaningful is having a space dedicated to allowing tribal leaders to sit at the table and express and air grievances, or even vent on so many other things that have gone wrong in the past. And we're not just talking past in the terms of like create inception of the country. We're talking past in the history of the district. So once you give a space for those to be voiced over time, and I've seen this time and time again, when consultations first came out, they were very they were very hard to kind of discern like what the purpose of them were. But once tribal leaders were given a space to air their opinions and thoughts and ideas and frustrations, then a new phase began to kind of unfold, where it's, here's where we have been and here's where things have gone wrong. Consultation is an ability for us to work together to move past that, to move forward, to always acknowledge that past and why we're trying to do what we do now. And it manifests in different ways. So consultation really allows school districts to understand what local tribal leaders would like to see and at the district level, whether that's, re-engaging with more meaningful, culturally responsive curriculum, or, really looking at the way that student needs are being identified, underrepresentation of Native kids in gifted and talented programs. I mean, it just really manifests in so many different ways. But consultation empowers the ability for that solution, that collaboration, to be very unique on a district-to-district level.
Thank you.
And I think to add to Julian, he says trust. My word is action. We have that platform, but it's the action piece also that is the reason, possibility why they're even having a meaningful consultation. And so I just wanted to throw that out there too, that the action piece, which derives from the trust.
Right. Yeah. So speaking of that, now every community has their issues. So what do you think the biggest issues are that faced within education, within the Native American community? What are some of the issues? Let's air some of the dirty little secrets that we might not know about, because educating on that is, there might be help and support to help fix them. So we'd love to know a little bit more, like, what are some of the biggest issues facing Native American education? Donna, you want to go first?
Sure, I could take a stab at.
There you go.
I think that the issues surrounding Native American education are so rooted in a history of upheaval. What other culture are you dealing with in education? Beginning with the government relocation of Native American children from their families and tribal way of life into the boarding schools. It's such a deep-rooted trauma and important piece that people, while more recently it's come to light with the boarding schools, but that's been around a long time. And I think that starting with that issue of understanding of where we come from on an educational beginning, that would be a big issue, to just kind of throw it out very generally.
Yeah.
Got you. Other issues that you see as a main issue that you would want people to know about that they might not know about?
I would say there's a couple of things. There are, first of all, the Bureau of Indian Education in the Department of Interior only represents about maybe 7 or 8% of all Native students in the country. But it's an important representation. It's of 183 schools. I think it's 47,000 students, is somewhere around there. But they experience a real high level of school environment issues, not only structural building structures that don't have running water, or, I think they did a survey a few years ago, and about 85% of all Bureau of Indian Education schools are run down or needing work.
Oh,
but
wow.
But then that's the bigger picture of school environment, and just environment in general. What does it take? What kind of environment does a child live in, or in order to come to school and learn? Is that child hungry? If they live in poverty, is there domestic violence within the home? Sometimes, the best meal that child gets when they come to school. So these are things that aren't often known outside of the, in the non-native population, that because people just can't imagine that a place like Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, which is the size of Connecticut, has like an 85 or 90% unemployment rate. There are, it's so the poverty level is very high, especially on the reservation schools. And that would be, we did a few years ago, school environment listening sessions, because of the high rate of suicide amongst our students. We have the highest rate of suicide amongst amongst students compared to other populations. And so we did that, and we talked to the students and elders and families and communities about what that environment was like. And that environment included things like mascots, how offensive, and not just offensive, but harmful, to go to school and have that kind of imagery, whether it be, whether it be three-dimensional imagery, a non-native person, on a horse, dressed up like an Indian, or whether it be the first thing you see when you walk into your school, is a caricature of a native person, and that affects. And so to me, I think, more should be done with all the money that's spent in this country. More should be done for schools on reservations to elevate them and raise the level of, just the structures. I mean, there are so many things, and I know Julian and Donna have both worked in those schools, so they know.
Right. I believe, so with these problems, what solutions? Are there any thoughts on how, so even if somebody's watching this and says, you know what, I want to get involved, I want to be a part of the solution, are there any thoughts or support that would be helpful? How can people get involved? How can they support to help change some of these things? Because, it definitely resonates, because within the demographics that I educate, we face very similar issues and challenges. So I understand you, brother. And we all need some help. So
Yeah.
what do you think you need? What do you guys need? What would be helpful?
I think I'm happy to start off on this one. I think one critical solution is needing more allies who have the courage to be in the spaces with tribes, to actually visit the tribes themselves, be a part of their physical spaces and their celebrations, their social events and gatherings, programs, not with something free to give, but with your time, your volunteerism, with your effort. Because I think the biggest impact in the long run is building trust, kind of helping set the stage for action. And I think above all, anybody can set up a program, create a brochure, and tout giving access to Native kids all day long. I did that as a grant program administration project director in the nonprofit field for years. The hardest thing to do was go to that community, knock on doors, and try to enroll kids in direct services. That was the hardest thing, because you have no trust. You have to build trust. You have to earn trust. You have to be an ally, be a part of their experience. That's what we need more of. We need more folks who are willing to do that hard work and willing to give their time. And in many cases, you don't have to spend a lot of money to do that, but time is money. So your biggest resource to spend is your time and your authenticity to get there.
I think too that I just recently had a very heated discussion with a previous high school friend of mine about why it is not okay to wear Native American regalia outfits as costumes during a Halloween, right? And we both, it was quite uncomfortable explaining. And what it comes down to is just educate yourself, and you want to know about the tribe. The argument was, we're just doing, we think they're great and we want to celebrate you. So we're do this, even though we tell you not to do it, having that kind of banter back and forth. It's like, just ask. You want to know more and understand, then ask. Have the conversations of Native American, not just in November, how, throughout the year with every other culture, not just us, but every culture, and have more of those culturally based discussions from the little ones. I taught kindergarten and it's doable. I would do a presentation and explain and talk, and they learned and danced, and we did a round. I mean, there's so many opportunities if you just ask. And and if you don't know, find somebody who does. We're here, put you in touch with somebody. We don't. Just ask, and we will be more than happy to share anything.
I would like to
go ahead, Ron.
I just wanted to say one thing that, and that's really great, both Donna and Julian. This is something not the Department of Education's responsibility. We can't do that. We can't do curriculum and things like that. We can't mandate certain things. But there needs to be a massive movement in this country to revise the textbooks so that young people are in school. When I used to teach, young kids, and they'd say, well, how could Columbus discover something? There were people here, little kids, they know that feeling, it's like, they know that you can't go up to someone's house, like in the boarding school area, and take the kids away. These are things that need to be told, and our textbooks need a huge revamping. so that people, do know that there are 3 forms of government, that an Indian tribes are one of them in the Constitution, so, and, our young people can learn so much. I mean, they can, even in social media, look at look what you need to do, you need to know to operate a phone or a computer or something like that. So it's not that this can't be taught. The states, control a lot of this, and it's really time that there's a movement in this country to revise the textbooks. And we have a holiday coming up that is not accurately portrayed as it has been when I was growing up, with the Pilgrims and the Indians and all that kind of stuff that happened. Tell the true story of Pocahontas. She was a very young woman that was stolen. So these are the things that it's constant, perpetrating these myths and stereotypes by not having textbooks and teachings in the classroom that correct this. Otherwise the next generation will learn the same thing, and they'll go to watch the Western movies.
I think there's so much power in what you just said, Ron, and it really resonated for me because with Native American culture, with African American culture, with probably Latino American culture, there's such a need to tell the story, and the story usually gets told from a middle-aged white male's perspective, and that's usually who has the ability to create the textbooks. And we need to do something different, because the story that is being told to the students within this country is very different than the story of what actually is occurring. And so, we're getting near close, and I was going to close differently, but I would really like to hear like 60 seconds, maybe in closing, like how can we put that to action? And Asian American leaders as well. Yes, thank you, Carol. How do we start to make sure these stories are told differently? Where do we start at? What would you guys like to see happen? I'll give you each 60 seconds to close. And how do we tell the story differently? Because the stories of your culture and your people are so important to the history of how this country was shaped and the foundation of it, but it gets told very differently, and even around this time of the year. So please, I think this is important. Again, does anyone want to take a crack at this with their 60 seconds first?
I don't know. I'm thinking all kinds of feelings right now when you ask me that, because for most of my adult career, I've been trying to address omissions in children's literature with where Native Americans are represented, and it's been an uphill battle. And I think that challenging the status quo, social justice, racial justice themes being brought in to education on a daily basis, not a monthly. And again, curriculum, I could go on and on about how I think of truth and the truthful account of history. It has to be done. And I see that there are movements being done to start that. And that's very exciting. Transparency, documentation. We know that, as you said, as Ron was saying, history is often told by the victor. And being people of storytelling and oral language, it's kind of hard to get our story out there too. So I taught college. I use children's books to teach how blatant the differences are. My first graders that I used to teach who are African American, they made the connection that Columbus stole Native people from their lands and took them back to Spain. My little first grader, Miss Sabis, that's just like happened to us. Word for word, that's what he said. So it's doable. We just need to do a lot more of it, I think.
Thank you, Julian.
Yeah, I would say, it's very evident that not a single one of us have enough time in our lifetimes to solve the issues that we all face in K-12 ed. But I think together as people, we have all the time we need, that we can all kind of work together, bond together to overcome these challenges. And I think one of the biggest things we can do to really face this challenge is do whatever we can in our various responsibilities to empower the role of bringing tribal departments of education to the table. Many tribes don't have full-fledged tribal departments of education. They may have one or two people. They may have a small program. Sometimes they may have a full-fledged department of ed. But tribes know what's best for their tribal citizens. The solutions have to come from them. The solutions have to come from that community. And I think the more that we can bring those folks to the table, the better and the closer we get to making sure services are more meaningful to that Native child. And they're deserving of everything. They're the next generation of Native leadership, and that's what we need.
Ron?
Yeah, thank you. What comes to mind is that not only our young people, but all people need to understand the contributions and accomplishments of Native people, and contributions to this country and the contributions to the global world, to the world in general. There are, language, foods, medicines. There are lots of contributions, and a lot of our young people don't know what those contributions are. We need to talk about the accomplishments. We can talk about Columbus in about 10 seconds. We know that. So when there's an opportunity to speak, and in a program like yours, which is so wonderful and goes out, it's, Native people have contributed to their communities, contributed to this country, and have contributed, internationally. I just met with the United Nations Rapporteur, and one of the things we were talking about is the language, the preservation and revitalization of languages. So it's resonating across the globe, that what is happening here, and we need to keep that going and keep that movement going.
Well, thank you all. It's been very, very informative today. Very powerful and eye-opening and enlightening. And I thank you guys so much for your time. I hope that people got a lot out of it. Just my closing thoughts, and I just see so many similar struggles that we go through as being an educator on a daily basis, that the best thing that I can do is hopefully connect to what you were saying, Julian, is offer the opportunity to be an ally and a resource, and being an educator and working with impoverished communities of people and helping them to achieve success through building systems. I'd love to offer the time and opportunity to see how I could continue to help support and be an ally. I think that you guys are doing some great things, and I ask that you feel free to call upon me and make me stick to my word here. And I will absolutely be willing to support. I want to thank you all for your time, and I want to thank Carol for helping us put this together, as she always does. I'm going to turn it back over to Carol for the final thoughts as we close out.
Thank you so much, Paul. And thanks to each of you. And what I'll say is that Global Minded is a big tent under which all of these amazing cultures and identities and ways that people define themselves and ways that healing can take place for centuries of injustices, that can't just happen with each of these different groups in isolation. It has to happen with all the people who are allies like Paul and myself and everyone else to support the work that you all are doing. So I just want to say, I think, Václav Havel said there can be a parallel universe to government, and we see Global Minded as a parallel universe where everyone really is invited to the table and everyone's valuable at that table and everyone can understand each other at that table. So we really hope to see you all live in June, and there are some really wonderful things that I'd love to explore with you all culturally, where people could even learn more about, your music, your healing traditions, your there's just so many amazing, rich traditions within your culture that could be shared, in a pre-conference or over the couple of days of the conference itself. So I really look forward to exploring that. I know Tom Stridicus from Fort Lewis wants to be part of that. We have a woman opening the dinner who is a 15-year-old Ava Native American, amazing singer from Oklahoma. I just think there's some really great things we can all do together to plan that. So I want to invite you all for that, and just thank you again for making the time for this. And we did record the session, so tomorrow in the newsletter, we'll share the link. And for all of you who signed up, you'll have the link. And we ask that you share it with at least, 10 or 15 people who would really value this work, and start to really share that through the networks, because that's how all of us can really raise, that consciousness and transform a lot of what I'll call the dominant caste actions. And, I grew up in college publishing, and, history was written by the patriarchy of privileged men who were, of the dominant caste. And so now it's time to tell the story of everyone else. And one of my favorite things about Indigenous cultures like yours is, no matter where you are in the world, the 4 ways of healing, singing, dancing, storytelling, and silence. And I just, I think the more we cultivate that in ourselves, the more we have a center, we're able to, put things in perspective. We're able to be the best people we can be. And so many of those things are from the relational and beautiful, aspects of your teachings that I think everyone could benefit from. So we look forward to being a vehicle to take that out there for all of you. So thank you so much for being here today, Celeste.
Thank you.
And I and everyone from Global Minded, so grateful for your time, and can't wait to see you all in person when we're not on little tiny tiles.
Yes. Thank you, Carol. Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
everybody. Take
Thank you.
care. Blessings.
Take care now.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.